Just to explain these notes real quick, these come from the section we are about to get in. 1 Corinthians 11 obviously brings up the idea of gender roles. And does anybody know the difference between the egalitarian versus the complementarian position on gender roles? Anyone even ever heard those terms before? What do you think complementarian means? So men and women have a complementary role. They are equal but complement, which means there are uniquenesses in their roles. And then there is the egalitarian position, which is men and women are equal in every single way. There is no difference between role, form, or function. So, what these notes are, one of the things that I like to do is when there's an opposing position, I try to find the absolute best argument for the opposing position that I can find and listen to it straight out of their mouth. So, these are notes I took during a podcast that was a 6-part, 1 hour each long podcast. So the first one is the egalitarian position. And I do have some Jesse's notes throughout it, meaning I kind of did little rebuttals in my head as it was going, but I'm taking notes as they're talking, and I've tried to go through and make them as coherent as possible. This is extra. And then at the very end, if you go to the back, there is what I would consider to be my opinion. The last 3 pages is the complementarian position. So the first position is the egalitarian, and it's just me taking notes as I'm listening to one of the head scholars, one of the head people who are kind of really pushing the egalitarian position today. And I took notes. These are things that she said. Okay? These are not things that I'm saying. I just want you to be clear. And then there is my position at the very end. But I think they're helpful because I have heard a lot of people tell me what egalitarians believe, and I've never heard an egalitarian say the things that people say that they believe. So one of the things we need to be careful of doing is not reading a book on someone saying, these people believe. Well, if they're not one of those people, then you probably shouldn't, you should take it with a grain of salt, okay? Now, I'm not one of the people, but I did my best to try to, so you guys don't have to listen to 6 hours worth of, not that you care, probably, I don't know. I care. That sounds interesting to me. So I sat through it. Anyway, that's that. That may come up. I may use it in our class tonight, but I thought it'd be good notes for you guys to have for you. All right, so we're kind of making a transition, okay, in 1 Corinthians. One of the things that we've been dealing with is questions that the Corinthians have been asking, and so it's been response, answer, response. And remember, we don't always have the questions. We know, Paul says, these are the questions you've asked, and he's laying them out. We don't always have the question, but we have the answer. And there's a really fun game that I like to play. It's called the paper game. I think I may have explained this before, but it just gives you kind of an idea where you get 4 or 5 people together, you hand them a piece of paper, and everybody at the top writes a question. Then you hand it to the person next to you, and they write an answer. Then you fold it, and so the next person doesn't see the question, but they see the answer, and they've got to come up with a question to the answer. And as you go through, you read the first question with the last answer, and you realize either it was spot on and everybody got it, or it's really far off. When we're doing these types of studies, we've got to be careful in assuming what the question is, that we have good guesses, and we have a range of what the question could be, but we don't have the specific questions. All right? Now, what Paul is going to be turning to, if you read in chapter 11, verse 2, It says, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything, maintaining the traditions, even as I delivered them to you." Now, the word tradition, what kind of, is it a rep does the word tradition get in religious circles? Huh? So tradition doesn't always get a good one, right? I'm going to just kind of put these out here in this area, hand them around when we're talking. It doesn't always get, why does tradition not always get a good rep?
Some traditions are traditions of men, and some are traditions of God.
What'd you say? Say that again. Into the microphone if you could. I would love for you to say it again. I didn't hear you. I'm really bad at hearing.
Is it on?
It's on.
Okay. Some traditions are traditions of men, and some are traditions of God.
Okay. Some traditions are tradition of men, and some traditions of the law. I mean, even look outside of religion. Have you ever met families, let's say maybe they have a Christmas tradition or an Easter tradition or some kind of, where a new person is married into that family, and they walk in and kind of go, "Why? I don't like this tradition, and I don't want to repeat this tradition." How is that usually viewed by the ancestors? It can be viewed poorly. Okay, so one of the things we have to really distinguish is between man-made traditions, God traditions. Not all a way in which you can do something. But we have to be clear to distinguish that this is a tradition that can be done this way. It does not have to be, right? And it's something that can be changed. We here, right, even in Lenoir City, what are some traditions over the last couple of years, especially since COVID, that we have changed? Yeah, I was going to say we're in Sunday evening right now, but we're not. That's Sunday evening. What have we done with our Sunday evening service? We've changed it from a worship to a Bible class, right? And is that necessarily wrong? No, because the Bible has nothing to say about a evening. Here, we got one right here. Make sure the green button's on.
I was just going to say that a lot of ways, traditions now can end up being a lot like hedge laws were back there with the Jews, where they start to kind of blur lines and things start to become, there are certain things, not everything obviously, but certain things tend to start to become, okay, is this something where we just kind of made a tradition of it? Like we made a way of doing this because it's close and we're just kind of being protected that way, or is it actually bad if we cross this line? Like if we stop doing this, or if we change how we're doing this?
Yeah, and the Jews, talk about hedge laws. Hedge laws, I don't need that. It's a protecting law, right? It's a law that you set up around another law so it does not get broken. And we do that for kids all the time, don't we? Don't we set up hedge laws for our kids all the time? It's not don't touch the stove, it's don't go near the stove. You're right? And hopefully as they get older, they realize it's not the proximity to the stove that's the sin, it's the thing that hurts is touching it. But you set up barriers so they don't get hurt. But those barriers sometimes, let's say, my mom told me not to go near the stove, and now I'm a full-grown adult and I'm cooking on the stove, and my mom's like, "Hey, don't you remember what I taught you as a kid? Don't go near the stove." I was like, "Mom, it's kind of hard to cook if I don't go near the stove." Right? I let Ashley do that anyway. But anyway, right? I'm just kidding. That's going to be funny because we're talking about gender roles tonight. Anyway, so you understand. But when Paul's saying, these are the traditions that I taught you while I was there, a lot of the way we do church doesn't come from the words of Jesus. It comes from the Apostle Paul or Peter, right? It comes from the epistles, okay? So anyway, I'm just kind of building a framework. And the things that he's going to be discussing all the way in these next 3 chapters, or 4 chapters, headship laws, right? So we're going to be looking at kind of gender roles, right? The Lord's Supper, right? Something that we continue. Spiritual gifts, we're going to be talking about, right? This idea of we are one body but many members, okay? That's going to be a principle that helps us do one of these things. Love being the greatest of gifts, right? The thing that we ought to pursue. And then finally, how we use the gifts, or how the church used the gifts in the assembly to build one another up. And that has been a principle that we've seen over and over and over again, hasn't it? Even when it comes to talking about meat sacrificed to idols. What is the number one goal? Is to make sure we are building one another up, right? We are glorifying God, but we're not causing each other to stumble, right? We're not causing each other to have unnecessary problems, okay? So the common themes that we've seen so far that are going to be pertinent in this section is division versus unity. The biggest thing, the reason why they're struggling with all the things they're struggling with, is because they're so divided, okay? They're divided on almost everything. Almost every single topic that Paul has talked about, there's a group that falls under this category, and there's a group that falls under this category. Okay, who's your favorite preacher? Well, we've got several categories that have come up, right? Those who are committing sexual immorality in the temple versus those in their own marriage who are holding sex for religious reasons, right? And then we got the meat sacrificed to idols. There are those who believe they have knowledge of those. I can eat whatever I want to eat. Then there are those who are struggling with eating the meat sacrificed to the idols. And both groups have their own problems. But at the end of every single discussion, what Paul has done is brought Jesus into it and love into it and saying, how does the gospel shape our understanding of all of these topics? Okay? So division versus unity, they're spiritually immature. So a lot of what we're dealing with in Corinth is spiritual immaturity. And so there are going to be things that Paul says that it's almost as if he's talking to babies, because they are spiritually babies, right? And he's wanting them to come out of this spiritual immaturity. And so one of the phrases that's going to come up often, it's already come up about 5 times in the letter, is judge for yourself, meaning I'm guiding you, giving you guiding principles for each of these, but ultimately every single person is going to have to do what? Judge for themselves to what is right and what is wrong, as long as they hold to the principles that Paul has been giving. They've been oppressing each other, okay? They've been taking each other to court, suing one another. Even the sexual immorality is the idea of using the rich oppressing the poor, the idea of using knowledge to oppress those without knowledge when it comes to meat sacrificed to idols, right? We looked at the idea of them eating at the table of demons and using that as a way to suppress one another. So, and then this idea of knowledge versus love keeps coming up. You may have knowledge, but knowledge without love, it's useless. And it's going to have a crescendo right in chapter 13. He's been building this love is the thread, right, that binds us all together. The twisting of the teachings of the church. So in every section, there are going to be things that they take a teaching of Jesus or a teaching of Paul and they twist it and they make it something that it was never supposed to be. Okay? And that's really going to be important when it comes to the Lord's Supper. And it's really going to become important when we come into the headship laws. Okay? And you'll see that here in a moment. Then there's been sexual immorality throughout, the judge for yourself. And remember, this is a response to questions. Okay? So, Paul has heard about the traditions that he gave them and how they've been handling it. We are just going to read the first section, 1 Corinthians 11, 2, all the way to 16. And I want you guys to pay attention and think about some things. If something doesn't sound right, keep that a mental note. If there's something that's really confusing, make a mental note. If there's something that you're just like, I just don't, right? Anything in this text, I want you guys, when I'm done reading it, I'm going to ask, what are your thoughts on this section? Okay? So be paying attention for comprehension. Now, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. And the word symbol is not in the Greek, so yours may just have, that's why she ought to have authority on her head, or authority over her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. All things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. All right. What are some things that you notice that maybe you're kind of like, what? I don't know. Anything.
The hair covering.
What about it?
Well, in one part it says you gotta have it covered, in the other part it says because she's born with, she has long hair, she's covered.
Okay. So in one part, it says, I'm going to just, woman, which is really probably the better term wife we're talking about. Cover your head. I'm going to use black. And then, maybe I'm not going to use black. There it is. And then he says, what? Your hair is your covering. Okay? Anyone else? We're going to go and tackle these one by one, but I'm going to get a bunch up there before you guys forget.
The same thing, which I understand that. It's just that because when he's talking about men too, what about these men that are bald? They don't have no hair.
Sorry. Sorry. So, right? And the natural question, that's a good question to ask. Bald men? Right? Which, now, in the text it says that men, right, having short hair, which I think bald would probably kind of fall into that.
Very short.
Right? Would just be very short. You still have little follicles up there, right? It's not gone for good, I hope.
I just have a simple question from a complex passage. So I just wondered what version you used, and so mine does not use the word husband or wife. Throughout the whole section it says man or woman, and so I'm just wondering what the original text was. Mine's New American Standard.
All right, so anyone have a guess of why one version would use husband and wife and one would use man and woman? It's the same word in the Greek.
It's context mixed with other things. Not every woman is subject to every man, but
Yeah.
wife is subject.
Yeah. So it's the same word in the Greek text. And so the translators have to decide, is he using the general term, all men are over all women, right? In every case. There are people who actually use this to talk about why I will never, it used to be, you don't hear this as much anymore, but you read some older commentaries, you don't work for a woman. There are people who struggled with women becoming like CEOs and bosses in companies because this principle is from creation that all men are over every woman. And so like the ESV and NIV, obviously this is a relationship between husband and wife, who is over one. And that has been something that Paul has been dealing with in Corinth, is the idea of husband and wife relationship. Okay? So that's the difference. But it's the same word, and the translator's got to choose, am I going to choose husband or man? Am I going to choose wife or woman? Answer your question?
Kind of. It does make a little bit of a difference.
Oh, it absolutely makes a difference.
So what do you think?
I would say that husband and wife is probably the better translation. The relationship between a husband and a wife. And it's going to bring it up later in chapter 14 about women who are speaking out in church, and we'll get there as we get, right? And they should go ask their husbands at home. There is this seems to be an imbalance, or there seems to be some contention between a husband and a wife usurping authority over her husband in the context. All right, so that's a good one. So how do I...
You have to use common sense. I mean, it'd be like me going over and telling Jamie's wife what to do when it's not my
Yeah.
position.
Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Comments?
It does specifically mention here about, a woman not covering her head, she should just go ahead and cut all of her hair off. And then in the reverse, for a man to have long hair, it'd be disgraceful.
Okay. So if you're not going to do this, you might as well what? Just shave it all off. Okay? So the idea of shaving. Man, there's a really good one in here that's kind of interesting.
Well, I think I know what you're talking about, but this is what gets me, that part that you just wrote down is what gets me. Like, cover your head. If you're not going to cover your head, you might as well shave your head. But your hair is your covering. So that seems like a circular thing. Like, if you're not going to cover your head, shave your head. Well, if your head wasn't shaved, then it was covered.
Yeah. So if you don't cover your head, it's a dishonor and you might as well cut it off, though your hair is your covering anyway. So either Paul is contradicting himself or something else is going on. Okay, so just hold that right there for a moment, because you're kind of where I'm at. Ellen? Oh, were you just itching your chin? Oh, thank you. I was hoping angels are just thrown in there in the middle of this discussion, right? Angels in symbol, which the word symbol is not in the Greek, but it's supplied.
If you go up at the beginning of 5, it says, a woman who prays or prophesies with the head uncovered. So if she's not praying and not prophesying, she can have her head uncovered.
Okay, so this is in a context of praying and prophesying, right? So we're looking at a specific instance, maybe. Let's put this up here. All right, any other ones out there? Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I have read and read and read and read and read commentaries on this. Very few agree on almost anything. They may agree on one section, but completely differ on the next. It is probably one of the most tongue-twisting sections, in my opinion, of trying to figure out what is Paul actually saying. Because depending on the section that you're looking at, you're going, what do you want them to do? Cover their head, shave their head, wear their hair, put their hair up, put their hair down, right? It's all of this. Now, one of the things we got to remember is they live in an honor-shame culture. Anyone know what honor-shame cultures look like? I mean, think of the movie Mulan. Right? I always try to use Mulan as a really good, once you bring dishonor on your family, you might as well not even be a member of the family anymore. They either cut you off to try to save some of their honor, right? Or they just take the shame because they don't want to cut you off, and they lose rights to a lot of stuff. Okay, so they live in an honor-shame culture, which Paul is very, if you're not going to cover your head, you might as well cut your hair off. Remember, he says that, and it's a command, by the way. He's writing that in the form of a command. It's imperative. It's not a suggestion. If you're not going to do it, cut your hair off. It's the same thing he does in Galatians 5, that if you want to keep the law and go back to circumcision, I'm telling you, just cut the whole thing off to men. He says, I want you to just mutilate yourself completely. Because it's pointless to go back to the law and back to circumcision when Christ has come. You might as well just mutilate yourself completely. And he's doing a very similar thing here. Now, this is where I am currently at in 1 Corinthians 11. When I say currently, depending on which pants I'm wearing that day, okay, has changed kind of where I fall on this. One of the things that Paul's been doing over the last 4 chapters that we've noticed is he quotes what? A Corinthian slogan or something that the Corinthians were saying, and then he rebuts it. I am going to read this in a different way, and I want you to see if, for you, this makes more sense, or if you go, you know what, Jesse, you're absolutely crazy. Okay? So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write it on the board. I'm not going to write the whole passage on the board, no. All right, we'll deal with all these things in a second, but I'm going to get rid of the covering. Here's where I'm at currently. Verse 2. Let me get I had to write it all down. All right. All right. 2 through 3 is Paul's teaching. Okay? 4 through 5 is what the Corinthians have done with Paul's teaching. Okay? 6 is Paul's harsh, which he's done before, harsh response of the you might as well cut it all off. That's where it's going to come in. You guys are not making sense. Okay? 7 through 10 is another Corinthian response or saying or whatever. And then 11 through 16 is Paul's closing remarks, okay? So I'm going to read it, and I'm going to say, hey, this is Corinth now. This is a Corinthian, they're saying, and just see if it makes more sense to you, all right? So here's Paul. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I have delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every woman